The Property Pod. Welcome to The Property Pod with Moneyweb. The property sector is an ever-changing sector. And in this podcast series, your host, Suren Naidu, chats to movers and shakers in the property industry.
Hi there and welcome to The Property Pod, South Africa's premier property investor podcast. On this weekly Moneyweb show, we gain insider insights from leading executives, analysts, developers, and entrepreneurs in the country's dynamic property industry. My name is Suren Naidu, and on the podcast today, we are talking to a lawyer about the role of the deeds office in the real estate industry. If you have bought or sold a property, you will have an idea, but the deeds office is a key part of South Africa's established property rights. The country has 11 deeds offices, which play a crucial role in ensuring legality and security of movable assets, according to law firm Cliff Decker Hofmeyr, Inc. On the show today, to share more insights on the significance of the deeds office, is Kirsty De Souza, a professional support lawyer in the real estate department of Cliff Decker Hofmeyr. Kirsty, a very warm welcome to the Property Pod.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Lovely to be here.
Simplistic question to kick it off. What is the deeds office and why do we need one?
Good question. I think a lot of people often ask that. So our South African deeds offices are government institutions. They're responsible for the registration and the management of all immovable property transactions and rights in land in our country. We need the deeds offices and rely on them as they ensure the legal transfer of property ownership. And of course, they maintain accurate public records of the various title deeds and mortgage bonds, servitudes, other real rights, etc. in land. And each region in South Africa has their own deeds office that actually oversees the properties within their jurisdiction. So it does also help that it's a little bit more bespoke for each deeds office. It's not a situation that someone who lives in Cape Town has to drive up to Joburg. Each jurisdiction actually has their own deeds office, and there's 11 of them.
Okay, that's good to hear. So it's a little bit decentralized. As a real estate lawyer, your industry deals almost daily with the deeds office across South Africa. Can you share a bit of history behind the deeds office and the role it plays in the property market? A little bit more detail.
Sure. So our deeds office system is actually pretty old. It was established, the system we know today was established in 1937 under the Deeds Registries Act of 1937. So yeah, if it isn't broken, don't break it. I think that's what most of the property sector has maintained for 80, 90 years. And we found that what works. So we've stuck to it. The most important role that the deeds office plays in the property market is obviously maintaining the records, and they're very strict examination duties. So it's not a situation that you're just going to have a property transferred because you walk in and you say, well, I'm selling my property to Mr. So-and-so, and then the registrar just stamps it. It doesn't work that way. They have very, very strict examination procedures. And obviously, in keeping these records and having these strict examination duties, they help protect and maintain the stability and reliability of our property system.
Talking about those processes, can you share some insights into the ins and outs of the registration process at the deeds office? And the reason I asked that question is also a follow-up. Has it got easier or more bureaucratic over the years? Because we've heard some interesting things about delays at different deeds offices in the country.
Yes. So, look, the registration process still takes time. As regards the ins and outs of the processes, it still takes time. How long it took 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, there has definitely been progress, if we put it that way. So the process itself still takes long because we have to touch base with various institutions. We still need to communicate with institutions such as SARS or municipalities and obtain the necessary certificates and consents or exemptions or receipts. And all of those documents still have to be lodged in the deeds office. So process is still time consuming, not necessarily with the fault being on the deeds office itself's shoulders. I think that's unfair, and I most certainly in my industry won't say that burden or name in the industry should lay on the deeds officer's shoulders. There's so many other government institutions, private institutions, associations that we need to deal with in order to obtain the necessary documents for a transfer or a bond registration. If there is a 1-week delay at SARS and a 1-week delay at the municipality and a 1-week delay because, let's say, the purchaser is out of town and can't sign the documents, all of those delays rack up. So a person then sees this transaction as being so heavily delayed, but the last step is the deeds office. So the assumption is that it is only with them that the delay has sat. And the reality is that it's not always the case. There have been times in the past where the deeds office has been very backed up. It doesn't happen that often anymore, to be honest with you, not in my experience. It's few and far between in comparison to, potentially what it was 15 or 20 years ago. It's definitely gotten better.
What is being done that you are seeing in relation to streamlining registration process and reducing some of these delays? Because I know you say it's not the deeds office per se, but maybe you want to share what's the average time, and I'm sure it takes different times in different parts of the country, but you might have a broad idea on that.
Perfect. Yes, so something that has definitely assisted in streamlining is the fact that we in the industry are making use of much better automation platforms. So these platforms have evolved significantly in comparison to what they were when I entered the market 15 years ago and what they are now. There's been such wonderful advancements. So those specific automation platforms are much more integrated with third parties. So for example, SARS and various municipalities. 10 years ago, you would approach a municipality with a handwritten application asking for clearance figures, and then subsequently paper-based document which is handed in asking for the certificate with a receipt. So all of that would have been very paper-based. Nowadays, we're making use of these third-party platforms where we're automatically connected to SARS via e-filing or the municipality via these platforms. So our applications, submissions, and receipt of the certificates are actually done electronically. So that's definitely something that has drastically helped streamline the whole transfer procedure. There's still more room for growth, obviously. We're a very technologically driven society, so there's still room for growth, but the growth has definitely been seen and felt in the industry in the last 15 to 20 years, for sure.
I'm going to be frank here. South Africa's national pastime, other than sports and braaiing perhaps, is complaining. And very often we don't realize, as you said, if it's a delay from the purchaser side, even a day on a Friday can delay the whole process. But how can conveyancers better educate clients on the importance of accurate documentation, etc., when registering, or there's a case of change of ownership at the deeds office?
I think the first step is always clearly explaining the property transfer or bond registration process, and especially with first-time purchasers, providing easy-to-understand guides. Me personally, checklists or your initial letter when it goes out to a client, I like to list everything that I'm going to require from that client from the get-go. So you already know that these 10 or 15 documents or answers need to be provided. And that way you can get going instead of asking you for 3 or 4 things now and then another 2 later, which definitely not only delays the process, but I think confuses a lot of people because they're constantly sending information in. So I would say probably that's one of the biggest things with educating is letting people know what is going to be required from them from the get-go. And of course, regular communication. I think people are absorb the information that is being given to them better when it is being communicated on an ongoing basis. So that makes a big difference. And I think one of the best bits of advice that I can give to the listeners is not to be afraid to ask questions. If you're not quite sure, I mean, if I'm asking you for a copy of your marriage certificate and a copy of your antenuptial contract, and you're like, why do you want that? That doesn't make sense. I'm married out of community of property. You shouldn't want that. I'm telling you now, my estate is mine. Ask me why I've asked you for that information, because understanding why I have asked for it will also help in understanding the various processes and potential delays. I mean, there's a knock-on in that regard. If you don't want to send me that information, it's not going to come in that initial email that you've sent with the information. So that delay means I need to ask for it again. So that knock-on effect can occur when people don't quite understand the process. And how better to understand a process than to ask? So please don't be fearful of asking your conveyancer questions. We're always happy to answer them.
Talking on the municipal side now, we know that municipal service delivery on all levels in most municipalities has deteriorated over the years, particularly if you hear what the AG's office has to say. But how does outstanding municipal rates and tax impact the property market that might be related more to the owner, but perhaps you want to share some insight on possible municipal delays and what can be done to address some of these challenges, both perhaps on the homeowner or purchaser side and the municipalities?
Good question. Tricky one sometimes. I guess it's the age-old saying, right? Death and taxes. There's certain things that will always affect you. So property taxes are no different. Municipalities rely on the income generated from these taxes to maintain the municipal jurisdictions that they oversee. These monies go towards further expanding or developing the infrastructure in that specific jurisdiction. So there is a great reliance on these taxes, and failure to secure these taxes negatively affects the successful functioning of that municipality. The reality is further that these taxes, they don't go away. They remain held over the property and subsequently the owner until the owner decides, well, they want to sell the property, and then they're saddled with this high bill that it has to be settled before they can transfer the property. We must, as property lawyers, conveyancers, lodge what's called a clearance certificate in our lodgement at the deeds office. The deeds office will not allow that property to be transferred to a new owner unless the municipal rates and taxes are settled in full. So that reality is that it doesn't go away. And I think a lot of people assume, okay, well, when I pass away, it might go away then. But it doesn't. When a person passes away, the deceased estate is then left to settle the account. And oftentimes, there's simply not enough money to cover that cost, and the property ends up being sold, which is probably not what the deceased had intended to happen to the property. In my opinion, something which I think should be considered to help address this is education. Educating communities, and me personally, I believe the youth, I reckon it should be a standard in high school training, is training on the practicalities of owning property in South Africa. Not the theoretical side, the actual practicalities, the responsibilities and the ramifications of non-compliance, property insurance, property taxes, various services. That education, I think, is paramount. That proper practical education, I think that will make a big difference in future generations understanding what property taxes are. In understanding that and where that money is supposed to go, it might help future generations or the future governments not be saddled with this kind of municipal debt that we are seeing at the moment.
Just to conclude, a last question here, talking about South Africa's grey listing. I know this is not the core topic of this chat, but integral to providing correct documentation both to the banks as well as SARS and all the different agencies, there has been an issue where the legal fraternity has been cited as possibly one of the slow to comply with certain elements. That's a separate issue, but do you have some insight and comments around that? Are things getting better? I know the bigger law firms are probably more strict about those things, but perhaps you want to comment.
Very, very, very strict about everything and anything in that regard. I can without a doubt say Cliff Decker Hofmeyr is, we drill it into our staff members and it is of paramount importance. But speaking on the grey listing topic in general, in relation to the property market, South Africa's grey listing has led to an increased scrutiny in our property market due to the heightened monitoring requirements that we just mentioned, which are aimed at combating money laundering and terrorism financing. This heightened monitoring, it affects the sector because it's now imposing stricter regulations. Those regulations relate to financial transactions, and by extension, it includes transactions that are related to real estate purchases or sales. Making foreign investment, it makes it so much more cumbersome and obviously less appealing to investors. So both buyers and sellers now obviously face more rigorous and strict due diligence procedures and requirements from the various banking institutions and us as law firms. With that additional due diligence comes additional compliance costs, because we do need to obviously make use of third parties to verify the information that we've received. So because of this, South Africa's grey listing may reduce the foreign investment that we see coming into South Africa, which has a knock-on effect in slowing down the property market activity. And once again, that knock-on effect then negatively will impact the overall liquidity in our property market. So it's not necessarily that the property market has, it's not that the property market has caused a grey listing. It's more a knock-on effect of the grey listing almost perpetuating the fact that the property market does end up taking a knock because of the additional and much stricter due diligence and double checking requirements we now have in place.
Kirsty, thanks for your time. I know we got over time a little bit, but appreciate your time on the podcast. That was Kirsty De Souza, professional support lawyer for real estate at Cliff Decker Hofmeyr.
Thanks for listening to the Moneyweb Property Pod with Suren Naidu. To listen to more episodes, go to moneyweb.co.za or the Moneyweb app and follow Moneyweb News for daily updates. Follow Suren on Twitter at Suren Naidu for more of his property industry content and other business stories. The Property Pod.